As we all know, 2010 was a landmark year for Doctor Who, because it marked the first time since 1981 that the show would switch producers while still on the air. Gone were Russell T Davies and David Tennant, and in came Stephen Moffat and youngest ever Doctor Matt Smith, along with a new companion, a new production team, a new logo, a new opening credit sequence, and a new TARDIS both inside and out. So it's safe to say a lot was changing. Such a radical upheaval in the popular show was always going to be very hard to pull off, so Moffat and Smith had a lot to achieve within their first series. However, with audiences being the way they are, usually you don't even get a full series to warm to viewers. You have to make a good impression within the first few episodes. Indeed, it was basically up to the 11th hour to make or break the Moffat era of Doctor Who right off the bat. So, with pretty much everything different to the era of the show people have come to love, was this episode about shape-shifting creatures and space eyeballs able to herald in the Moffat and Smith era of Doctor Who in a satisfying way, like many fans claim? Or is it actually a massively overhyped post-regeneration story? Well, throw away your 10th Doctor sonic screwdriver and handcuff Stephen Moffat's wandering spare hand to a radiator, because it's time to review the 11th hour. And I'm going to get absolutely slaughtered for this one.
Do you want to shut up now? I've got backup on the way.
Not only did the 11th hour have to introduce a new Doctor, but more importantly it had to establish the brand new Stephen Moffat era of the show, but it had to do so without immediately alienating the audience the show had carefully cultivated over the course of 5 years. Right from the beginning it retains a familiar staple of the Davies era, zooming in on Earth in the same way viewers had become so used to in those previous episodes. It's a good touch because it reassures the viewer that the show hasn't gone anywhere. It's still the Doctor Who you know and love, just in a new form. I imagine this was a conscious decision, because they would have known how hard it would be to keep the audience on board, so it's a subtle yet effective way to create a bridge of sorts. The episode also flexes the new budget with some fancy CGI and epic sequences like the TARDIS crashing, so it all looks quite visually impressive and more up to date than the Davies era, even if the HD is overly sharpened to an ungodly level. And the soundtrack also wants you to know it's a new era, since it shoves I Am the Doctor down your throat at every turn. I'm not even kidding, it appears like 5 times in this one episode alone. So it really sets the tone for Moffat's era's obsession with the track, since it's similarly shoehorned into every episode. The 11th hour also sets up one of the driving forces of both Series 5 and the Moffat era as a whole, since Amelia has a big old crack in her bedroom wall. I think this speaks to everyone's experiences of being scared by something mundane when we were children, since there's always the irrational fear of a monster under the bed or a shadow of something on the wall. So having Amelia scared of a seemingly harmless crack makes her feel quite relatable. It turns out that this is actually a crack in space and time itself. And I know it's not this episode's fault, but the crack is such an annoying Moffat puzzle box. The typical mystery where it sets it up in a fascinating way, only for it to outstay its welcome and blunder around not knowing what it was ever supposed to be in the first place. Even this scene has a big irregularity, since it serves as the way for Prisoner Zero to escape, despite every subsequent crack just sucking things in and erasing them from time. The only other time it serves this portal kind of purpose is with the Time Lords in Time of the Doctor 3 years later. So it's pretty weird. And speaking of overarching plots, even Prisoner Zero seems to know everything that's going to happen throughout the Smith era.
The universe is cracked. The Pandorica will open. Silence will fall.
Sorry, are you sore from having this crack business beaten into your skull? My main problem with this is that Prisoner Zero is just a run-of-the-mill monster, a throwaway monster of the week. The closest thing to compare this scene to is the Series 4 story arc, where you had people mentioning things like the Medusa Cascade and something being on Donna's back. But the difference is, when that happened in Fires of Pompeii, it was being said by psychics, characters who had the ability to see into the future. So it made a lot of sense and worked as a chilling piece of foreshadowing that was justified within the story itself. Here, on the other hand, it's just some random alien who apparently knows everything about the TARDIS being blown up by the silence and causing cracks through time. It's just so weird and doesn't make much sense in the bigger picture, because why would Prisoner Zero know about this stuff, let alone tease the Doctor about it for seemingly no reason? I'm just not quite sure what the point is. All you need to say is that silence will fall. It doesn't make sense to include the Pandorica and malicious cracks within this scene, because it feels too telegraphed.
Look, is he really you?
Yes, I'm afraid so.
One of the core components of any post-regeneration episode is having the Doctor acting a bit wild and out of control as they get used to their brand new body and personality. I mean, if you were to undergo such a radical transformation, you're bound to get a bit frazzled and try to choke your friends like they're women on Tinder. I do like Moffat's take on the concept with the 11th Doctor. The post-regeneration madness taking the form of food cravings, leading to the fun sequence of him rejecting whatever a media makes him. The editing is very smooth and fast-paced, so it's an enjoyable rollercoaster ride through different snacks. However, I do think the comedic vibe skews a bit too far into childish CBBC territory. Part of me genuinely wonders if it helped contribute to the wider public perception of the show shifting towards it being just a kids show for nerds, since it no longer has the goofy and campy yet fun for all ages joy the Davis era managed to perfect. The scene is still memorable though, and it definitely caused an epidemic of kids demanding to eat fish fingers and custard. So I guess that shows the appeal of such a scene. And hey, it also gave us this potential meme template. However, Amy developing this imaginary friend relationship with the Doctor presents a new problem: hero worship. People like to criticise his characterisation in the Davis era, since that period of the show turned him into a literal god, but I've always thought the Moffat era was just as bad when it comes to this. Even within this introductory episode, the Doctor is already famous within the village, everyone recognising him from Amy's drawings and stories growing up, so he already feels too unnaturally special and godlike, which seems unnecessary to establish so soon.
Are you the Doctor?
He is, isn't he? He's the Doctor!
It's him though. The Doctor, the Raggedy Doctor.
The Raggedy Doctor! It's him!
Time for what, Time Lord?
A big criticism of Doctor Who is how much they get out of jail free card the sonic screwdriver is, since it can basically solve any narrative issue the writers run into. This is why it's great that when the Doctor is trying to expose Prisoner Zero, the sonic blows up and fries. The screwdriver can often take away from the character's natural intelligence, which is one of the reasons behind it being removed in the John Nathan Turner era. Even though the lack of a sonic screwdriver doesn't continue into the rest of the Smith era, taking it out of this episode is a smooth way to phase out the Davis era design, feeling more natural than them just replacing it without an explanation. This is also a good way to introduce high stakes, because the Doctor has to go back to the fundamentals and save the world purely with his big brain, which is smart storytelling. Post-regeneration stories like to do stuff like this, usually putting the Doctor out of action with everyone else having to try and stop the threat, with only minimal assistance from the newly regenerated Time Lord. I appreciate what this episode does though, since the Doctor has to get heavily involved, but without any of his usual tools, so he has to improvise against a big scale antagonist, working well as a trial by fire of sorts, without taking the very risky approach of having the Doctor asleep for significant portions of the episode, because as we all know by now, a lot of people don't like when they do that. Indeed, with Prisoner Zero on the loose and the Atraxi about to incinerate the planet, the Doctor and his newfound companions split up. Amy and Rory go into the hospital, whilst the Doctor watches porn and video conferences with a UKIP homophobe. You know, the usual Saturday night on Discord. Oh, and by the way, check out the official Harbo Wholmes Discord in the description below. It's a very technobabble scene that makes absolutely no sense, and it's thrown at you quicker than the 11th Doctor barging in while you're looking up Moffat's Clara self-cessed fanfiction. But it's still a fun moment as the Doctor goes full Hacker Man mode. It's a good setup to the ending, even if that solution makes absolutely no sense when it actually rolls around. I also find it weird that the Doctor just thrusts Jeff in this position of responsibility, expecting him to somehow black his way into leading this team of scientific experts from across the world, despite not knowing anything about him. Dude just wanted to polish the one-eyed gopher, and now you're making him pretend he knows anything about science. Seems a bit unfair to me. What if he had failed GCSE physics? The world might have been blown up. However, it all works out in the end, with the Doctor ultimately confronting the Atraxi and condemning them for threatening the planet. It reminds you of how protective he is of Earth, especially because they're breaking intergalactic laws with their threats. Unlike previous stories, the Doctor hasn't really been going through an identity crisis in this episode, but the climactic rooftop scene is pretty much designed as his so-called Doctor moment. The big triumphant scene where the audience can finally accept the character and see that they're the same as they've always been. He's full of bravado, and it feels amazing to see all those clips culminating in 11 walking through the face of the 10th Doctor, communicating that change whilst maintaining the overall identity. He's a different man with a different outfit, but the core is still the same. He's still the protector of Earth and won't stand for this kind of alien intervention. It's a satisfying climax, probably one of the only good uses of I Am the Doctor, since it obviously suits the title of the track itself and allows the Doctor to shine with a triumphant victory speech. One of the biggest and most common Moffatisms is having a usually female character encountering the Doctor as a child and becoming enraptured. Indeed, pretty much the biggest example of this is one Amelia Pond, whose shed the Doctor crashes into. Now, I've never been shy about my dislike of adult Amy. She's one of my least favourite companions in the show because of how abusive she is to Rory, and just how generally unlikable she is. But I do like her initial introduction. Moffat clearly wanted to play upon that dream we all had as children, to hear those iconic TARDIS engines outside and to go on an adventure with the Doctor. So it is a very relatable scene. Even though it is a big Moffat cliche, it's a good enough premise, and Caitlin Blackwood is probably the best child actor the show has ever had. She feels like a real person, but not annoying and wooden like most other child actors. And thanks to Blackwood being Karen Gillan's real actual cousin, the visual similarity is there as well, so it genuinely sells you on this being a young version of Amy Pond. Therefore everything comes together well in the scene, and thanks to Matt Smith's kooky portrayal of the 11th Doctor, you can understand why she cultivates this imaginary friend status for years to come, since the Doctor promises to come back in 5 minutes before disappearing for 12 years. Yes, much like in The Girl in the Fireplace when the Doctor returns, it has been a very long time, Amelia Pond now being Amy Pond. I do like this twist, since it's a good way to represent the Doctor being too late. This sudden transformation into this completely different, grown woman. The change is so instant that you don't even really clock onto it at first, so it does feel clever when the truth is revealed. And just as a side note, I think it's quite telling that Moffat's first ever companion is a sex worker. Since he's always been obsessed with sexualising his own characters, he can just never resist writing with one hand.
I'm a kissogram.
I do appreciate that Amy resents the Doctor for never coming back. She was living with an aunt she hated in a village she hated, so the Doctor represented an escape, but she ended up having to spend 12 years wondering if he ever even existed at all. The scene of him convincing her he's real is incredible, even with the random J.J. Abrams lens flare sneaking in and out of nowhere. Much like in the later Deep Breath, this isn't just the Doctor convincing his companion that he's the same person. It's almost talking directly to the audience themselves. People had become so accustomed to David Tennant as the character that there was a real fear of people instantly rejecting Matt Smith, so scenes like this reassure the viewers themselves to give him a fair chance. The moment is therefore perfectly thought out and works incredibly well in winning over the skeptical audience, so it's a vital inclusion. One of the few things we get to see about Amy's personal life is her Giga Chad boyfriend Rory Williams, although in this episode he's still in his basic, unevolved form of the mild-mannered dorky nurse. I've always felt bad for Rory. I mean, his literal first scene in the episode is him getting chewed out by a superior, despite him being completely justified in his claims of the comatose patients wandering around the village, especially because that's exactly what happens, as the Doctor goes full Sherlock mode and spots Rory filming Prisoner Zero. It comes completely out of nowhere, but it's a good communication of those detective skills the Doctor has always had.
The sun's going out, and you're photographing a man and a dog. Why?
Also, Amy introducing Rory as just her friend immediately shows how badly she mistreats him. She's so desperate to bonk this mystery man that she won't even address her partner as such, which is frankly an awful way to introduce a relationship to the audience. Especially as she oogles the Doctor undressing whilst Rory is standing right next to her, clearly uncomfortable at her doing so. I mean, he is completely justified, because anyone would feel inadequate in his position. And of course, we all know it's only acceptable when it's Paul McGann, obviously. I'm not sure how I feel about Prisoner Zero, the big slimy serpent alien thing that can transform into throwaway guest actors who will go on to become famous staples of British television. The concept itself is fine, if unoriginal, since it has all that shapeshifting fun with different people playing the villain, but it falls a bit short for me, because the episode has to juggle so much that it doesn't really have time to flesh out Prisoner Zero in a satisfying way. The villain just feels underdeveloped, but I do quite like the mistakes the monster makes, speaking with the wrong mouths as it tries to get used to the human form.
Bark for me.
Also, Moffat really loves the corner of the eye concept. You always see it in his work, whether that be with the Weeping Angels, the Floof, or here with the Perception Filter. I'm not exactly sure why he's so enamoured with it, but I love the chilling reveal of the secret room that nobody has ever noticed before. It's very creepy, but hey, at least there's somewhere else to store your big finish. And naturally, because Prisoner Zero escaped from prison, the police are after him, surrounding the Earth with their giant eyeball spaceships. I know I'm not the first one to make this observation, but I would have much preferred the Jadoon to take the place of the Atraxi. Having a familiar monster involved would have taken a little bit of the burden away from all the introductions and made it a bit more easier to write, kind of like how Davis used the Autons because they're something simple and familiar, so it's easy to balance them with everything else, which the Jadoon would have helped to achieve. At the hospital, Amy and Rory encounter one of the only British actress in the world, Olivia Colman. I would admit it's very clever for the villain to have switched into the most sympathetic form possible. By pretending to be this lost and confused mother and her children, she can get closer to Amy and Rory and kill them before they can clock on, so it's a good, logical use of the shapeshifting format, rather than just using it as a cheap gimmick. However, before Prisoner Zero can explain to the Doctor everything about the Silence, the Kavarian sect, the Crack in Time, River Song and the universe being rebooted, all the clocks in the world go full Y2K, which is apparently good enough for the Atraxi to find the source of the virus and find the fugitive. The solution itself is typical for Doctor Who, but my problem is the lead up, because this all boils down to the throwaway video conference scene. It kind of parallels the much hated resolution of Last of the Time Lords. It feels so anticlimactic and cheap, along with Moffat just completely derailing it with a bad joke.
Who the man?
This is one of the biggest problems with Moffat as a writer. He always puts in these clearly bad jokes before immediately having a character acknowledge the fact it's a terrible joke. And before you start vigorously typing away that it happened more in the Davis era, I would like to point to two reasons it worked well there and not here. Firstly, the Doctor was on both ends most of the time. One of the main running gags was this.
I've been boot in a boot.
No, don't do that.
Hoots, mon.
No, really don't.
So it was actually funny when he was the one with the awkward jokes falling flat, especially because David Tennant always delivered these moments perfectly.
Don't get yourselves in a lava.
Secondly, the tone is important. These moments fit perfectly into how Davis handled his era as a whole, because it was always a very campy time. However, Moffat took a much more serious approach. So when he tries to write these awkward, intentionally cringe, self-deprecating jokes, it feels so forced and out of place, actively conflicting with the tone of the show under his control. So what's the point in doing it in the first place? We've barely gotten to know Prisoner Zero, haven't seen it pose much of a threat, and the Doctor solves the danger through the use of some keyboard mashing and a mobile phone, with the payoff to that being a bad joke. It just makes no sense, especially as Moffat desperately tries to re-up the ante with Prisoner Zero taking the form of Amelia. I would admit it's a good way of illustrating Amy's feelings of betrayal, but rather than the Doctor being forced to confront how he let her down, she just saves the day through the power of imagination. So what was the point of Prisoner Zero in the first place if this is going to be the payoff? Just making it impersonate itself to be caught? It reminds me of one of the Moffatisms that appeared in the Doctor Dances and Blink, using the monster's power against them. Although this probably is the weakest use of the concept yet, because surely any shapeshifting species would have some kind of safeguard against this exact scenario.
Oh, I can see you've been doing the TARDIS up a bit. I don't like it.
After saving the day, the episode comes full circle, with the TARDIS returning to Amy Pond's garden, and the Doctor once again late. I find it weird that Moffat goes back to this idea. It worked really well for the beginning of the story, but he seemingly only shoved in the 2-year skip for the wedding dress reveal, so I find it really weird and unnecessary. However, I do like how awestruck she is at the impossibility of the TARDIS. Obviously we've had these kinds of scenes before with each new companion, but this is the first time since Rose that the audience itself has also been completely in the dark, because they hadn't seen the interior yet either. So it makes it a very special moment with a beautiful score. Even if I don't really rate the console room itself, the introduction is magical. It validates that childhood dream of being whisked away in the TARDIS in the dead of night. It's simply a rare first TARDIS scene that captures the magical surrealness of such a machine. However, I'm not sure if I like or dislike Amy's reasoning for running away. I love the idea that, like the Doctor, she feels out of place where she grew up, creating some parallels and giving her a good justification to travel, but I don't really like that she's running away from her wedding. It continues to show just how little she cares for Rory, since she won't even admit the next day is her wedding, just in case the Doctor still wants to bonk her or whatever. I don't know, it just kinda reflects badly on Amy, something that only worsens throughout the series as she becomes less and less likeable, but we'll get to that down the line. The 11th Hour is a good opening episode, serving as a great introduction to new characters and a brand new Doctor Who era. However, there's just something about it that feels lacking. I don't think it has enough pizzazz to blow me away like it seems to have done for a lot of other people. I feel like it's almost style over substance in a way. It tries to be all flashy with unnecessary lens flare and more bombastic music than ever before, including playing I Am the Doctor about 20 times within an hour, which is absolutely infuriating. It just feels like it tries to show off more than creating an engaging engaging and exciting Doctor Who episode. Prisoner Zero doesn't really do much at all and feels massively undercooked. The shape-shifting concept is decent and used well, but I see no reason why it couldn't have just been something familiar like a Zygon, which doesn't need too much explanation. The same goes for the Atraxi too, since they feel weirdly integrated into the episode. On the other hand, Matt Smith is great and immediately hits the ground running as the 11th Doctor. Since he had already filmed Time of Angels and Flesh and Stone, he had already warmed to the role and grown into the character, so his performance is perfect, instantly getting viewers on board with his take on the iconic Time Lord. It's also a decent introduction to Amy, with that meta throughline of her needing to be won over by the Doctor, which the audience can definitely relate to in some way. Overall, I would give the 11th Hour a B ranking on the Series 5 tier list. I know that might be sacrilege to some people, but remember, a B is like a 7 or an 8, it's still a good ranking, but the episode just doesn't impress me enough to score any higher. Despite it being a year later, the HD somehow looks worse than the 2009 specials. Even though the lighting is great, the image quality feels too overly sharp to an uncomfortable level, which gives it a bit of a stunted presentation. The 11th Hour is definitely an overrated episode, and whilst that doesn't mean it's bad, it just doesn't live up to the hype. Now, if you don't mind, there's a crowd of Doctor Who fans outside holding a giant cross with my name on it, so I'll see you next time. And I'd like to give an extra special thank you to my Platinum level patron Fallon Cortez, and all my Gold level patrons Alex Marston, Calvin, Daniel Shillito, Francois aka Line Vortex, George, Herna Verzog, Mega Man 0781 and Stefan Evan Miller. Thank you so much for your support.